In a world full of distractions, there is one big question on every dog owner's lips.
How do I become more than just the person holding the other end of the leash?
We all get dogs with a dream in mind, a vision of the future. And if right now your everyday reality isn't quite that picture you had in mind, you are in the right place.
It really doesn't have to be this way.
You absolutely can and will be more to your dog than just the person who gets in between them and the world.
The key is you need to be more sexy.
More sexy than the neighbourhood cat.
More sexy than the jogger in the park.
More sexy than that half-eaten hamburger they just found on the floor.
And yes, even more sexy than the dog across the road.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Lauren.
Together we're Absolute Dogs.
And you're listening to the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast.
Welcome to the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast, the podcast that teaches you how to be the best dog owner your dog could ever wish for and to have a stress-free life with your dog.
Now, today we have a super exciting message for you, an episode for you. And the thing is, so many people ask us this very question, and yet we've never really tackled it. And that is, I'm going to get another dog. I plan to get another dog, or I plan to get a dog. How do I make sure that dog, my choice of dog, complements either my current dog, my current household, my current family, my current setup, my current other dogs? How do I make sure I pick correctly, knowing that actually this is going to be an interesting time and we're going to make this commitment for potentially the next 20 years of our life together?
Absolutely. And so in effect, this is kind of the first step to having a harmonious multi-dog household. And while there's always going to be training, you can never get away with not doing the training, nor would you want to get away with not doing it. Matching is really, really important. And, you know, the first tip that we've got for you here is that actually every dog has their strengths, every dog has their weaknesses. And if we think about when a multi-dog relationship, a multi-dog household might get a little bit stressful, or you might get kind of fights breaking out, or just general struggles of overexcitement.
Squabbles and general like prickliness and general just edginess around the house.
What that is often driven by is actually two dogs that have kind of a similar weakness in that maybe they're both very, very excitable, or they're both maybe they're worriers, or maybe they value their resources and they can't disengage from them. The key is when you put two dogs in the same room with the same weaknesses and they can't kind of balance each other out with appropriate strengths, then what you often get is kind of damaged relationships, and they're not necessarily long-lived relationships unless, of course, we're doing training, and there is always a game for that, but we're talking about what to do before you get into that situation.
Now, the big thing is this is a cool moment. You failed to prepare, you prepared to fail. So let's prepare. And actually, on this note, I suppose I should say to all of you, if you've got a friend who might be getting another dog, if you have family who might be getting another dog, if you know someone who is making this decision right now, or you're listening thinking, oh my goodness, that is exactly what X is going through right now, or Y is going through right now, then you can share this episode, because we're going to dive straight in here to exactly how you can get this right, Tom?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you go about sharing it?
So the way that you can share it is by sharing a link to the podcast, or just telling them to, search Absolute Dogs or Sexier Than a Squirrel on iTunes or Spotify or anything else, and you will find this episode.
So basically, this is something we want you to pass on as a message. We know it's a common struggle, and we're going to dive right in.
So the first tip that we had for you was to match up those skills. So when you're working with maybe a rehoming center, or you're working with a breeder, or someone who knows about the dog that you're interested in bringing into your family, and really what you're looking for is for them to give a reasonable description of what they're good at, what they're not so great at, and don't see it as like this is a weakness and this is how they're going to be.
More like a job interview. The way I would look at it is a job interview. And the reason I would say that, let me think. When I first brought in sort of gun dogs into my household compared to having herding breeds, wow, a difference, and wow, an eye opener. Yeah. Like, it was such an eye opener for me as a person, for me as for them as my family members, for me as a dog trainer. The fact that actually when my border collies have been a little bit edgy and spooky at certain ages, absolutely not seen that so so much in gun dogs or blink for sure. And I know we're generalizing here, but actually I think there's a place for that. Much less barky, much less spooky, much less likely to have like those explosive reactions. Not saying they don't. What we're saying is less likely. And then if we consider things like, I don't know, tendency for my cockers to want to carry things. They want to carry all the time. And yet my border collies absolutely isn't in there to do something like that. And so I suppose it's like looking at them and thinking, and then does this wind the other dog up? Does this make it difficult for the other dog? Does this, I suppose, fill the bucket, right?
Absolutely. And so if we can match those, match the weaknesses with an appropriate strength, or the skills with an appropriate
I'm thinking
lack.
of another one is walking. I love walking with gun dogs and herding dogs, because the gun dogs often get the herding dogs to go off sniffing. And yet the herding dogs have been so busy eyeing everything up for hours and hours and hours and hours that it's quite nice to give them a bit of a de-stress and go off sniffing. And I really like to see that. Again, in my experience, they're not so noise shy and they're not so aware of noises, whereas border collies and herding breeds certainly can be. You kind of balance it up, you level the household up, you make the household just feel a little bit more harmonious somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the big questions that we get asked, and of course, when we're talking breeds, we're definitely talking generalizations, and many dogs, a lot of dogs don't read the breed instruction manual of how they should behave,
or can go a little bit faulty. I for sure had a border collie who liked to nip way too often and take it a little bit further. Poppy was certainly a very, very naughty but nice dog, and actually wasn't necessarily completely true to her breed on the extremes that she went to. The thing is, what we've got to remember is, like Tom said, they haven't read the journal, right? That's
it. And so, the other question that we often get asked, and again, we're talking generalizations here, is what to do in terms of matching the gender of the dog.
Such a common one. Do I get a boy? Do I get a girl? I've got, let's say, and this podcast has come directly from a client asking us, I'm going to get another dog. I have a female. She's she's just a year old, or she's close to a year old. She lives alone. She's the apple of our eye. And in fact, we would like to get another dog. We were thinking about a bitch, but some people have said maybe a dog would be better. What do you think?
Yeah. And so the answer to that is that there's so much individual variation. And when we're talking about these things, actually the variation between individuals in dogs is far greater than the variation between breeds or the variation between genders. But the interesting thing is that when we're talking entire dogs, entire animals, what we're thinking about here is actually, if we were to think about the female, well, every time a female dog has a season or a heat or whatever you want to call it, they're very unique as a species in that for 9 weeks following that season, they have high progesterone. Now, that high progesterone causes them to be more reactive, causes them to become more pessimistic.
Seriously vigilant, much more vigilant.
They'll value resources more than they normally would, and they'll be prepared to, want to keep those resources. And if there's a confrontation, then following that season, they'll be much more likely to engage in that. And so if we think about then two entire females in the same household, and you think about how often they can kind of synchronize their cycles, that can be a bit of a recipe for disaster, because now what you've got is two females that now have the same weaknesses because they're being hormonally driven by progesterone.
Often together.
Yeah, to be more reactive, be more pessimistic, to, be more prone to resource guarding, and they're living in the same space. That's a concern. And yet, we think about then matching, say, a female and a male. Well, you know what? The male's not going to have those phases of progesterone. And of course, we can talk about neutering, but actually it's worth talking about this because in some countries, neutering is considered, it's a mutilation. It's not something that should be done. And so, if you've got all the information, all the biological understanding, then you can actually make great choices.
Now, Tom, I've got a question here, and this might be a bit too out there, and you might just say, Lauren, this was not a question for the podcast, but in the past, dogs that we've had here at training, even when they have been, they're not entire, so they're spayed, bitches, they can still seem to be hormonally driven, or at least have times when they are much more difficult for bitches to live with other bitches. And I know that we've had lots of people here as clients or at the centre, or coming to stay, and have had that struggle. Do you think that's a valid, and this is coming at it from a vet perspective, is this a valid concern, or is this because those bitches definitely seem to have that, but I can also see tendencies to be similar anyway.
Yeah, so again, there's way more individual variation than variation between genders and breeds and whatever else. But often what you'll find is that when a bitch has had a season, they've become, more pessimistic or whatever else. Because it's 9 weeks that happens over with a dog, and they're totally unique as a species in that respect. Actually, they can learn a lot of bad things in that 9 weeks following the season. And so if they've had a season, they've had that 9 weeks, and if maybe they've not made some great choices in those 9 weeks following that season, and then they're spayed, actually the learning can continue.
So effectively the rehearsal's already there, the learning's continued.
They can continue to maybe be more prone to resource guarding, or, if they reacted to another dog, especially another dog in the household at that time, that can persist despite the hormones no longer being there. So there's a lot of debate about if to spay, when to spay, and whatever else. But if we look at the facts, actually 9 weeks of progesterone after every season, that is a 9-week window where behavior is very vulnerable as a result of that, and struggles can develop in that 9-week window that then can persist despite the hormones settling down, regardless of whether they're spayed or between seasons. Effectively, after the 9 weeks, we enter this period of anestrus, where the hormonal cycling isn't happening, and so actually they are much the same as a spayed dog in that, or a neutered female dog in that time, and so it really is what they make themselves vulnerable to learning in that time following a season. So really, there's a lot of debate about matching and whatever else, and there's no hard and fast rule, because the reality is there's way more individual variation than anything else. But one thing that we can say for sure is that keeping many entire females in a small space, all of them cycling, that is potentially, if not well managed, and you're constantly reshaping their brains and growing their skills, that's more challenging.
It's much more volatile situation
than
to be
having like 2 males or a male and a female, for example.
Now, again, and this was a really brilliant student who asked us this question, and she said, how about a male and a female? Now, the thing is, and I think this is really important, that we consider female, male, female, male, in lots of different respects. But for me, I should say, actually, again, it's the right male. Just like we said, it's the individual. So it is still looking for the right male. Yeah. So her dog is fairly level, fairly balanced, has probably had 1 season and then spayed, I think, because she was spayed at a year. So likely to have had 1 season and then spayed, although I am surmising here. And so actually could be nice to put her with a male, could potentially be okay to put her with a female. Actually, most importantly, needs to be the right dog that we match with. Yeah.
And so when we talk about matching, we're talking about matching potential weaknesses to strengths so that the other dog can compensate. So for example, let's say one dog
Let's take Bet. Bet is very, 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 very fast twitch, reactive, quick type.
Absolutely. And so she would find movement very, very stimulating. And so the pairing that maybe wouldn't be natural
we've always said Easy and Bet.
Exactly. The pairing that wouldn't be very natural is to pair her with a dog who, in a small space, with a dog who's also stimulated by movement. Because one of them moves, it'll stimulate the other, it'll make that one move, that one will then move more, and you enter this vicious cycle.
Like amazing, fast twitch, cool energy, high energy, serious eye sort of stalk on them. They're just really, they're probably very, very similar.
Yeah,
in lots of ways.
And that's what we, if you match for similar weaknesses, or and when we say weaknesses, some weaknesses are strengths in other situations.
Like I consider
just not in the house.
They're reactive, like dogs, both of them. But I consider that a real benefit to what we do, and that's why they look so great on camera. And when I say reactive, what I mean is fast to react to us. Yeah. They're not bad. They're not difficult with other dogs. They're really quick to listen, quick to respond. Yeah. I'd say we're both reactive, and so I think it depends on what we're talking about, but mostly.
And that's it. And so what we've got is now 2 dogs that actually. It wasn't a problem when they were by themselves, but then you double up and they get themselves in tricky situations. Another example might be where one dog struggles to disengage from another dog, right? But maybe there are 2 examples that could go wrong here. Maybe putting another dog who also can't disengage from other dogs in that situation, you're going to have constant play and constant overexcitement, and you're going to have to work really hard to make that a calm space. And yet, if you potentially matched a dog that liked other dogs with a dog that maybe didn't value other dogs, but was absolutely cool, calm, and collected with them, that's probably a much more appropriate combination, because then you've got dogs that can live harmoniously. It's like not constantly play. And of course, we're talking natural behavior here, their default. But all of this can be trained. And, the question from the student was, what should I do? How can I best prepare? We're talking about how best to prepare. Some of you are going to be listening thinking, oh, I see my issue here. I have 3 dogs and they all have the same weakness. Oh dear. No, that's absolutely fine. There's a game for that. There's stuff that we can do to
Loads
grow
of
them
solutions.
forward on it. We're specifically answering the question. If you're in the situation where you've just got one dog and you want to add another,
considering another dog, or considering adding a dog to your household, and maybe you've got Cat's family, you haven't actually got your dog yet, you're pre-listening, you're preparing. We've got lots of great owners like that. Another thought that I had with our dogs, I remember walking Poppy, and one thing that she really could do to a group of dogs, any group of dogs, is she could kick arousal through the roof. So you'd pop her on a lead. So I'm thinking now, I walk Ever and I walk Style together down the bridle path. If I was to put Poppy into that mix, she would have them all squealing. So they would be walking going, he, because Poppy did. And so another one would be going in the vehicle to a dog show. As soon as she was in the vehicle, the whole vehicle would be like, and yet they're quite nice to take. They're really nice to take alone. They are nice dogs to travel with. And yet Pop could throw arousal through the roof. Like the arousal would be gone. And that was, again, just one dog adding to the mix of they had the tendency there. And at the same time, they wouldn't necessarily do it alone. The arousal with her in the mix just always seemed to mess it up. I don't know. And that was just how it appeared.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that when we talk about multi-dog households, and there's a whole episode on multi-dog households.
Please check it out, guys.
Check it out if you're thinking, oh gosh, now I understand why my multi-dog household is stressful. Listen to that episode. But the concept that we introduce you to there of the household bucket. So every dog effectively sharing this same bucket. And exciting things pay into that bucket. Often it can be one dog in the household that's contributing the most fill to that bucket, and they're filling that bucket the most, whether it be because they're constantly on the move or they're constantly being stimulated by the other dogs moving or whatever it might be. And so I guess there are some personality types that actually putting them in any multi-dog household, there's definitely some training that's going to need to be done. And like Poppy is an example of that. She was very stimulated by other dogs' movements. She was also quite a movement-based dog anyway, and would be quite reactive to, any event would up arousal.
Probably the first dog that we worked with doing rewarding nothing, didn't we? We came up with one of the training academy games.
Yeah, she didn't understand the concept of doing nothing. And so you put a dog like that into any multi-dog household, and you can turn 6 horizontal dachshunds into crazy beasts by adding that kind of bucket fill to that environment. And so I guess if you're listening to this thinking, I've got one dog or I've got 2 dogs and it's all gone fine, I'd like to add a 3rd dog, and you're thinking, I'd like to make my life as easy as possible and not artificially train something. This is what we'd advise. We'd actually say, make sure you're matching a dog who's naturally calm. Make sure you're thinking about a dog who isn't necessarily stimulated by the movement of other dogs, because you're putting them into, the big environment.
Consider how they complement each other. Consider how they can balance each other out. Again, this morning I was walking Blink, and she helped me to walk Brave, who was slightly more aware of noises. And because there's a lot of banging going on site, I took her with Blink. Blink goes out and they balance each other off. And I can't say that in my experience, as much as we certainly said that we don't want to generalize too much here, I would say on the whole, male and female together, I have, from the training center, a lot less friction with the right male and female. I think that I seem to see same sex seem to have some more struggles potentially, and we're generalizing completely here, but at the same time, that's what I've seen in numbers. And at the same time, you get the right dog, the right bitch together, actually they can really work nicely. The right bitch, the right bitch, they can work really, really nicely together. Again, so many things to observe, so many things to learn. It's not a right answer, it's not a wrong answer. It's what can we train to improve the situation if we're in it, and what can we do to prevent the situation if we're not already there.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully what you take from this is be intentional, and then make the leap of faith and acknowledge that actually they're complex animals and we can't account for every single variable.
There's no perfect, right?
Exactly. And the thing that we keep coming back to is there's way more variation between individuals than there is between, say, genders or breeds. And so, work with the breeder, rehoming center, person who knows about that dog, talk about, what your dog's great at, maybe what your dog needs to work a little bit more on, match them up so that you don't need to work on the same thing with both dogs, and you're going to find it a lot easier to integrate a new dog into your house.
Now, we hope you enjoyed this episode. It's been, I think, really enlightening to talk about it. And all through one of our training academy students asking us, actually, what do I do? What do I do? And that was all from her question in the academy.
And that's our tips. So with that, guys, that was this episode of the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast. Leave a review if you have not already. Share this with a friend if they're looking for a new canine partner. And we will see you in the next episode. Remember, stay sexy. Hey, before you go, have you taken part in the worldwide Sexier Than a Squirrel Challenge?
It's a 25-day online video program, huge energy, amazing community, and over 6,000 people are already taking part.
The only question is, you know where you are today, where do you want to be 25 days from now? Head to absolutedogs.me/sexy.